Some killers act out of rage, others out of greed. But these men killed for something colder: betrayal. They were lovers once, boyfriends, husbands. But when trust shattered, they didn't argue. They plotted, they played nice, and when the moment was right, they ended it. Not just the relationship, but the woman who thought she was safe with them. Before we dive into these killers, tell us, where are you watching from? And what time is it there right now? Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The real monsters aren't hiding in the dark. They're holding your hand. Mason Callister ran a roofing company out of a dusty corner of rural Georgia, the kind of operation with a single pickup truck, 2 part-time laborers, and business cards printed at home. He was known locally as reliable, not friendly, not warm, but always polite. He showed up on time, charged fair, and fixed things without small talk. He wasn't a man who made people laugh or left strong impressions, but people remembered he never missed a job, never raised his voice, and always cleaned up the nails after repairs. He lived just outside of town in a brick house on a half-acre lot, nestled between trees thick with Spanish moss. His fiancée, Layla Jensen, had moved in with him after 4 years of dating. She was a transplant from North Carolina, an art therapist with a background in trauma recovery. Layla was soft-spoken but expressive, always painting or hanging crystals in windows, leaving herbal tea packets in every cabinet. Mason didn't mind. He found her eccentricities tolerable. In fact, he liked that she made the house feel different, more alive. They rarely fought. She cooked, he fixed. She read, he mowed. There were no warning signs, no black eyes, no slammed doors. Just a quiet home, dimly lit, that smelled like lemongrass and paint thinner. Mason was comfortable. That changed the day he came home early from a job and found Layla asleep on the couch, her phone buzzing repeatedly beside her. He rarely checked her phone, but that day, something in him itched. He looked. The messages were from someone saved under Taylor, a man. The texts weren't explicit, but they were emotional, layered with subtext. Can't wait to see you again. Last weekend still in my head. Did he suspect anything? Mason didn't confront her. He didn't wake her. He placed the phone down and stepped outside to smoke a cigarette, even though he had quit 3 years ago. The next morning he acted normal, kissed her forehead, made her oatmeal, drove to work. But while hammering shingles into a second-story roof, he was already forming the outline. Not rage, not revenge, just method. He started small, took note of her weekly patterns, when she showered, when she left for her art classes, when she made calls on speaker. He knew she never turned off location services on her phone. He began syncing her GPS history to his laptop, quietly watching where she went on weekends. A second town, a specific neighborhood, a rented studio. That confirmed it. Mason didn't spiral. He simply began preparing. He started with a list in a weathered notebook he kept in the glove compartment. Cleaning kit, rubber mats, distraction tools, disposal plan. Each entry had a box next to it. Each box was eventually ticked. He suggested they take a weekend off in the mountains to reconnect. She looked surprised but agreed quickly. "I've been hoping you'd want that," she said. Mason nodded. He rented a remote cabin 2 hours north, cash payment, no ID. He chose one with no working landline and a long gravel path that didn't appear on Google Maps. On the drive up, they talked about future plans, maybe a second dog, maybe a road trip to Asheville. Mason smiled at all the right places. She took pictures of the trees, the wild flowers, the dusty orange sky. He complimented her photography skills. That night, they made chili together, played cards, and opened a bottle of wine. She wore one of his old flannels, barefoot, humming as she poured 2 glasses. Mason waited until she finished her drink before pretending to hear something outside. "Could be a coyote," he said. She followed him out the door, holding a flashlight, her hair pulled back. She turned to say something, and that's when he stepped behind her, pulling the heavy plastic bag from under his coat. He had practiced the motion several times. He sealed the bag over her head in one clean movement, wrapping a ratchet strap around her neck and pulling tight. She fought, but only for seconds. The bag was industrial grade, reinforced. Mason counted the seconds out loud in his head, even as she collapsed onto the deck. When she stopped moving, he stayed still, watching the trees sway in the wind. Then he dragged her body back inside, closed the cabin door, and began the cleanup. He moved efficiently, like he was performing a job he'd rehearsed. Mason had brought rubber mats in the back of his truck and now rolled them out across the cabin floor. He laid her body on one while he retrieved the backpack he had packed days earlier: gloves, zip ties, plastic sheeting, bleach, and 2 towels. His hands didn't tremble. If anything, they were steadier than usual. He wrapped her body in one of the sleeping bags they'd brought and secured it with nylon cord, tying each end with knots he used for hoisting bundles of shingles. Then he folded the plastic over it and rolled her toward the door. The trunk of his truck had been cleared out earlier that morning, down to the emergency kit, even the spare tire. He lifted her into it with more ease than he expected. It was around 2:30 a.m. He didn't leave the cabin right away. Instead, he spent the next hour scrubbing the wooden deck with soap and bleach, brushing between the grooves. Inside, he wiped every surface they had touched, repackaged the uneaten food, and washed every dish twice. He deleted the camera roll on her phone, took out the battery, and placed it in the bottom drawer of his toolbox in the garage, something he'd deal with later. Before sunrise, he sat on the porch, drank the last of the wine, and lit a cigarette. Not once did he feel panic. He drove the truck out of the cabin around 5 a.m., heading toward a remote area he'd scoped on an old forestry map, an abandoned well site once used by a mining company in the 60s, located 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The area had been marked as unstable terrain. Locals avoided it. He turned off the main road and drove another 40 minutes through a series of winding trails until he reached a rusted chain-link fence with a bent sign that read, "No trespassing, unstable ground." Perfect. Mason parked behind a thicket of overgrowth and walked the perimeter on foot first, checking for recent activity. None. No fresh tracks, no trash. The well itself had been sealed with plywood years ago, but the wood had rotted through in spots. He pried it open, revealing a dark vertical pit that seemed to go on forever. Mason hoisted the body from the truck with a pulley rig he built from an old deer stand harness and slowly lowered it in, foot first, until he could no longer see it in the shadows. Then he dropped 4 slabs of sheet metal down after it, covering the bundle. He finished by dragging branches and rocks over the top, obscuring the entire structure. When he stepped back, the ground looked untouched. He left before the sun crested the ridge. On his way back, he stopped at a car wash 2 towns over and cleaned the truck inside and out, vacuumed the mats, wiped the interior, pressure washed the undercarriage. He even paid cash for a fresh coat of wax. Back at home, he placed her packed duffel bag at the foot of the bed and texted one of her co-workers from her phone. Decided to take a few solo days. Needed a reset. Will call when I'm ready. He sent a similar message to her mother, then turned the phone off completely. Over the next several days, he played the part of a confused but patient fiancé. He visited the yoga studio and asked if anyone had heard from her. He even posted a message on her Facebook timeline. "Miss you. Call me soon, babe." No one suspected a thing. Not yet. Her car remained parked outside the cabin, which he had carefully locked and left looking untouched. her purse, ID, and keys, all disposed of in a lake the following night. Each item dropped in separately at different mile markers. The news of her disappearance didn't hit local outlets until 5 days later, when her employer officially reported her missing. By then, Mason had already woven a story. They had gone to the cabin. They argued. She wanted space. She met a woman at a general store who offered her a ride into town, and she left. That's what he told police. That's what he told her mother. That's what he repeated on loop, word for word. And for a while, it worked. The cabin was searched, but nothing incriminating was found. No blood, no signs of struggle. The only oddity was her missing phone and the fact that none of the women in town recalled seeing anyone matching Layla's description. Mason said she used aliases when traveling, claimed she was always mystical like that. Police noted his behavior as oddly unemotional, but not criminal. Still, a detective named Karen Mully remained unconvinced. She requested a deeper look into Mason's financial and GPS history. That's when the cracks started to show. His truck's onboard navigation system, which Mason had forgotten recorded trip logs to an internal hard drive, showed multiple trips in the weeks leading up to Layla's disappearance to an area far north of the cabin, one that didn't correspond with his alibi. When questioned, Mason said he'd gotten lost. But when pressed, his story began to contradict itself. He claimed to have stayed at the cabin the entire time, yet data showed otherwise. Surveillance from a gas station near the well site showed his truck refueling at 6:13 a.m. the morning after Layla vanished. Then, during a second sweep of the cabin property, a forensics team found a single utility glove half buried beneath a deck plank. It had traces of Layla's hair on the inside. The evidence wasn't explosive, but it was enough for a warrant. Police returned to the area surrounding the old mining well, this time with cadaver dogs. The dogs reacted instantly, circling the collapsed cover and barking. Recovery was dangerous due to the depth, but eventually they extracted enough. A scrap of fabric from the sleeping bag, Layla's earring, and a necklace chain she always wore. Mason didn't resist when they came to arrest him. He answered the door, nodded once, and asked to grab his jacket. No confession followed. No words at all. Just the sound of cuffs clicking shut as he was led out of the same house he had once built for a life that was supposed to last forever. The arrest didn't make headlines at first. A local paper mentioned it in a 2-paragraph column beside an ad for lawn fertilizer. Man detained in connection with missing fiancé. That was all. No mugshot, no statements, no press conference. Mason Callister sat in an interrogation room for nearly 9 hours the day they picked him up. He didn't cry. He didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. He just folded his hands and waited. Detective Mully sat across from him with a yellow legal pad and a soft voice. She wasn't the aggressive type. She asked about his roofing business, his favorite breakfast spots, how long he'd known Layla. She let the silence stretch between questions like rope. When she finally asked him where he had taken Layla's body, he looked up, not shocked, not angry, just calculating. He gave no answer. Not that day. Not the next. Mason was booked on obstruction charges first, then formally charged with murder once the earring and fabric were matched to Layla's personal effects. The trial didn't happen until nearly 2 years later. In the meantime, he stayed in county lockup, refusing interviews, declining visits. Layla's family held memorials without a body. Her mother flew in from North Carolina once a month and sat across from Mason during the pre-trial hearings, her face stony, her hands folded just like his. Mason's defense tried to argue lack of motive. They suggested Layla had vanished voluntarily, claimed the evidence was circumstantial, that the dogs were unreliable. But the prosecution had more. They'd subpoenaed Mason's emails, internet history, even pulled fragments from his partially wiped hard drive. They found searches. How long until a body decomposes in water? How to erase tire tracks? Non-toxic sleep aids. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was smoke, a lot of it. The defense countered by saying Layla had made similar searches. She was a therapist, they argued. She researched strange things for her clients. But it didn't hold. Then came the GPS logs, the receipts for supplies he'd claimed not to have purchased, the inconsistencies in his timeline. A key witness was a supply clerk from a remote tool shop who remembered Mason buying 4 ratchet straps and 6 feet of steel cable, items Mason later claimed were for roof harness repairs. The jury listened for 10 days. They deliberated for 2. On the 3rd afternoon, Mason was found guilty of second-degree murder and tampering with evidence. The courtroom was still. Mason didn't react. No sigh, no drop of the shoulders. Layla's mother stood up, walked out, and never looked back. Mason was sentenced to 35 years without parole. No cameras were allowed in the courtroom. No statement from him was ever released. But in the final weeks before his transfer to state prison, he wrote a letter. Not to Layla's family, not to the judge, to a former co-worker, someone he'd once taken fishing. The letter was short, typed on jail paper. It read, "She wasn't supposed to leave. I wasn't going to beg. I just wanted it to be quiet. That was all." The co-worker handed it to police. It was never publicly released. The cabin where it all happened was eventually sold to new owners who had no idea. The well site was permanently sealed by local authorities. The glove, the necklace, the fabric, all held in evidence indefinitely. Mason Callister became inmate 491202G, assigned to a low-activity work program within the prison system. He refused therapy, refused interviews, declined parole hearings when they were offered. For years, he simply existed, eating the same meals, pacing the same yard, sleeping in the same concrete cell. His roofing company dissolved. The house was foreclosed. Every trace of the life he built with Layla vanished, except for a few boxes in evidence storage and a case file labeled Cold Logic. In the end, the story didn't become a podcast. It didn't trend. It didn't even become a warning. It stayed buried, just like Layla. Not because no one cared, but because the kind of evil Mason represented wasn't cinematic. It was boring, quiet, careful. A man who didn't snap. A man who made her dinner, took her hiking, and watched the sun go down before making sure she never saw it rise again. Mason never confessed. He never had to. His silence told the whole story, but silence isn't always still. Sometimes it performs, smiles, deals cards, and sometimes, like Brian Holloway, it kills while it's smiling. Brian Holloway knew how to hold attention without trying. At 6'1", with manicured stubble and a steady voice, he wasn't flashy, but he was sharp. He worked 5 nights a week as a blackjack dealer at the Sierra Mirage, a mid-range casino in downtown Reno that catered to tourists, weekend gamblers, and married men who wanted to feel dangerous for a few hours before heading back to their lives. Brian was different from the other dealers. He wore custom shirts, kept his nails clean, and always made eye contact. Not too much, just enough. His tips were higher than anyone else's, and he never got written up. When he wasn't on the floor, he stayed quiet, skipped post-shift drinks, and went home to a condo he kept obsessively clean. Tea hats where he met Camila Torres. She was a travel nurse on a 13-week trauma rotation at the regional hospital. The first night she walked into the Sierra Mirage with her co-workers, she had her hair up in a tight bun, wore no makeup, and still looked better than every tourist in the building. Brian noticed the moment she sat at his table. She only played one hand, lost, laughed, and walked away. But she returned 2 nights later, alone. This time, she stayed an hour. He never flirted, never crossed the line. He played the part, charming, disarming, distant. When she finally wrote her number on a napkin and slid it his way, Brian only smiled. Their first date was dinner at a rooftop bar. Camilla asked questions. Brian gave vague answers. When she said she didn't usually move fast with people, he nodded and said, "Neither do I." 3 weeks later, she was spending the night. 2 months later, she'd moved in. She brought life into his condo. Hanging plants, fruit bowls, a new shower curtain with whales on it. She sang while brushing her teeth, left sticky notes on the mirror. Brian let her do it all. She started telling people he was different from the men she'd dated before, that he listened, that he felt solid. But Brian had rules, even if he never said them out loud. He watched her closely, made mental notes when she left late for work or spent too long in the hallway talking to neighbors. He memorized the way her phone lit up when she got texts, how many buzzes, how quickly she picked it up. Then one afternoon in May, Brian came home early. Camilla was in the shower and her laptop was open on the kitchen island. He didn't touch it at first, just glanced. The screen showed an email. The subject line read, "I'll be in Reno again this weekend." The sender was someone named Adam. Brian's pulse stayed steady. He moved closer. There were other emails, old threads, references to past trips, hotel rooms. Camilla's replies were short, but they weren't innocent. "I don't think he knows. Not sure if I can this time. He's been really calm lately." Brian didn't scroll too far. He closed the laptop and sat on the couch. When she came out, towel around her waist, humming, he smiled at her, asked how her shift had gone. That night, he made dinner, cleaned everything, told her he wanted to take her away for her birthday. "Just you and me, no phones, no work." Camilla lit up. She asked if they could go to Lake Tahoe. He said he'd already booked it. She didn't notice him watching her eyes when she said thank you. The next few days, Brian prepped. Not emotionally, strategically. He visited a friend who worked in casino first aid, asked about controlled sedatives for a prank. The friend laughed but offered ideas. Brian left with a vial of fentanyl and a warning. "That stuff's no joke." He researched dosages, tested it in water, practiced injecting it into fruit to see how it mixed. At home, he cleaned the trunk of his car, folded down the seats, and lined the inside with plastic. He bought a heavy-duty sleeping bag and pre-packed a duffel with gloves, rope, bleach wipes, and a prepaid phone. Everything was calculated. On Friday morning, they left for Tahoe. The Airbnb was 2 miles off the main road, hidden behind pine trees and closed off from neighbors. The place had no landline. Cell signal barely worked. Camilla unpacked like it was a honeymoon. Candles, snacks, a book she'd been meaning to read. That evening, Brian cooked her dinner, pasta with lemon cream sauce. He opened a bottle of her favorite wine. She didn't notice the faint bitter smell when he poured her second glass. Midway through their movie, she said she felt dizzy. Brian helped her lie down on the couch. She kept saying she was just tired. He asked if she wanted to go to bed. She nodded but never stood up. 10 minutes later, she wasn't moving. Her chest rose once. Then it stopped. Brian sat there for a while. He didn't cry. He didn't pace. He checked her pulse 3 times to be sure. Then he slipped the syringe into a paper towel and placed it in a Ziploc. He zipped her into the sleeping bag and carried her body to the trunk of the car. It was 11:42 p.m. when he backed out of the gravel driveway and drove toward the state forest. He didn't speed, didn't play music, just drove, calm, alone, and fully in control. The forest road he chose wasn't on most modern maps. It had once been used by logging companies decades ago, but was now nothing more than a narrow dirt stretch barely wide enough for a truck. Brian had scouted it months ago during a solo hike. At the time, he'd told Camilla it was a good place for stargazing. Now, under the pale wash of his headlights, it looked exactly the way he remembered, unmarked, unguarded, forgotten. He drove for 45 minutes past the last visible cabin, deeper into the woods, until even the moon disappeared behind the trees. When he reached a clearing, he stopped. No cell signal, no tire tracks, no power lines. Perfect. He pulled the truck into a dip in the landscape and turned off the engine. Everything went silent. He stepped out, zipped his jacket, and walked to the back. He didn't hesitate. He opened the trunk, lowered the sleeping bag to the ground, and dragged it 30 yards into the brush. His boots crushed pine needles. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called once and went quiet. He found a patch of disturbed earth where a tree had fallen years earlier. Using the foldable shovel from his emergency kit, he dug for 20 minutes until sweat soaked through his collar. The hole wasn't deep, but it was enough. He lowered her in, still zipped inside the sleeping bag. He covered the hole with dirt, then leaves, then broken branches. To a passing eye, it looked like the floor of any forest. He even scattered a few energy bar wrappers nearby to mimic lazy campers. Back at the truck, he wiped the handles with bleach, changed into fresh clothes, and sealed the used gloves in a trash bag. The drive back to the Airbnb took over an hour. It was nearly 3 a.m. when he pulled into the driveway. Inside, he cleaned. Every counter, every knob, every dish. He poured out the rest of the wine, bleached the glass, packed Camila's bags as if she'd left in a hurry. He burned the napkin with the drug dose scribbled on it. He deleted the last few texts from her phone and sent one to her sister. "Hey, taking a few solo days. We'll call when I'm recharged." Then he turned the phone off and left it in the glove box. In the morning, he called the host and said they had to leave early for a work emergency. The host never met them. Keys were dropped in a lockbox. On the drive back, Brian kept the radio low. When he got home, he placed Camila's packed duffel on the bed. He opened her laptop and sent a few emails, short, casual messages to her boss and 2 close friends. "Taking a break. Might extend contract in Utah. Will update soon." None of them replied immediately. People were used to Camilla being spontaneous. That gave him time. Over the next week, he maintained the illusion. He texted from her phone occasionally. He updated her Facebook with a vague post about finding peace off-grid. He even visited the hospital once and brought donuts, telling her co-workers that she'd flown to New Mexico for a funeral. No one questioned it. Camilla was kind, but private. She moved frequently. Disappearing for a few days wasn't strange, until it was. 2 weeks later, her sister tried calling. The phone was off. Then her mother. Then her roommate from New Mexico messaged Brian directly. "Hey, is Camilla okay? No one's heard anything." Brian replied with a screenshot of an old message from her. "Just need to unplug for a while." That bought him another 3 days. But suspicion was building. Camilla's supervisor finally reported her as missing when she missed payroll processing and failed to return a hospital laptop. That triggered a report with Reno PD. 2 plainclothes officers visited Brian's condo. He played confused, said they had gone to Tahoe, that they had an argument, that Camilla had decided to stay behind and hike with some girls she met. He mentioned their Airbnb, described her leaving with her duffel, said he hadn't seen her since. They asked if he was concerned. He said yes, said he figured she just needed time. "She's spiritual," he added. She disappears sometimes. It's her way. The officers took notes, asked to see her room. Nothing looked out of place, but something about Brian, his control, his lack of stammer, stood out. Still, without a crime scene or a body, there was nothing they could do. Camilla was an adult, no signs of struggle, no confirmed evidence of foul play. Brian was logged into work the day after they returned, had receipts, alibis. The case stalled, but not for long. 2 weeks later, a hiker found something strange near a forest clearing north of Tahoe, a patch of disturbed soil with a corner of fabric poking through. He reported it to a park ranger. The ranger marked it for follow-up, then forgot. 3 days later, heavy rain eroded the topsoil. When officers arrived, they found a partially unearthed sleeping bag, zipped shut, with human remains inside. Identification took less than 24 hours. The teeth matched Camilla's dental records. The medical examiner ruled the death as homicide by overdose. The sleeping bag had faint traces of fentanyl residue. By then, Camilla's phone had been reactivated. Investigators traced its pings, location logs, and metadata. They saw it was turned off for days, then turned on briefly, from Brian's neighborhood. Surveillance from a gas station 2 miles from the burial site showed Brian's car passing at 3:12 a.m. the night she vanished. When questioned again, Brian changed his story, said she'd wanted to experience solitude and had refused to share where she was going. But his voice cracked this time. He mentioned a friend named Adam, but couldn't give a last name. When asked about the sleeping bag, he said he didn't know how it got there. They hadn't brought one, he claimed. That was a lie. A search warrant was filed. His condo was torn apart. In a storage bin beneath the bed, they found the trash bag of gloves. On one, Camilla's fingerprint. They found the syringe he thought he'd thrown away, stuck inside a sock, still with residue. They found browser history fragments for how long can you text from a dead person's phone and decomposition timeline for fentanyl overdose. That was enough. Brian Holloway was arrested during his shift at the Sierra Mirage, mid-hand, as he dealt a 7 to a drunk bachelor party. He said nothing, just held out his wrists and smiled like he'd been expecting them. They brought him in just after 10 p.m., escorted quietly through a service entrance so the casino crowd wouldn't panic. His shift manager stood in the hallway, too stunned to speak. Brian walked calmly, didn't ask questions, didn't demand a lawyer. In the interview room, he sat with both palms flat on the table and asked if he could remove his tie. The lead detective nodded. Brian folded it and placed it beside him, smoothing it like it mattered. They began slow, reviewing the timeline, the last known location, the Airbnb. He repeated what he'd already told them, that Camilla had decided to stay behind. But when they brought out the phone records, the gas station footage, and the photos of the unearthed sleeping bag, Brian blinked. Just once. The detective watched his throat as he swallowed. They asked about the gloves. He said he used them for work. They asked about the syringe. He said it wasn't his. They asked about the sleeping bag. Same brand as the one in his closet. He said lots of people own that brand. Each answer was precise, rehearsed, devoid of panic. But the story didn't hold, and Brian knew it. Over the next 12 hours, he said little. He asked for water. He used the restroom. But he never confessed. No breakdown, no guilt. Just calm deflection until they stopped asking. He was booked at 9:23 a.m. the next day for second-degree murder, use of a controlled substance to commit homicide, and obstruction of justice. His mugshot made it onto local news that night. His expression was unreadable. Word spread quickly through the hospital. Nurses cried. Camilla's supervisor punched a wall. Her mother flew in from Santa Fe and identified her daughter's earrings at the precinct. She didn't cry, just stared at them, nodded once, and walked out. The trial took a year. Brian's defense team pushed for voluntary manslaughter, arguing that Camilla's overdose could not be proven as intentional. They claimed she had access to narcotics from her hospital work. They suggested she had struggled with anxiety, maybe self-medicated, but it was weak. The prosecution had the texts, the emails, the location data, the drug residue, the timeline inconsistencies, and, most damning of all, the fact that Brian had impersonated her for nearly 2 weeks after her death. They subpoenaed his browser history, cross-referenced purchases, and even recovered deleted messages from his cloud account. His search terms sealed his fate. Can police trace location if phone is off? Best forest to bury body, Nevada. How to use fentanyl without syringe. The jury took 5 days to decide. The final count, guilty on all charges. The judge handed down a 40-year sentence with no possibility of parole. Brian showed no emotion, just turned, nodded once at the bailiff, and walked out of the courtroom like it was just another shift ending. Camilla's family declined interviews. Her sister later said, "We don't want her remembered for how she died. We want her remembered for how she lived." But the story lingered. The case was profiled in 2 true crime documentaries. A podcast episode went viral, and Brian, inmate number 70,491-NV, became a cautionary tale in college psych classes about personality masking, calculated emotional control, and post-murder manipulation. In prison, Brian kept a quiet routine. He worked in laundry. He read legal texts. He filed 3 appeals, all denied. He never took visitors, never wrote letters. When a journalist once requested an interview, he replied with a 1-line rejection. "You don't talk about the game while you're still in it." That line circulated online, turned into memes, quoted in forums. But inside he was forgotten. No fights, no outbursts. Just another man in gray, folding towels, eyes always steady. His condo was auctioned off. Camilla's belongings were returned to her family. Her forest grave was converted into a memorial. No plaque, just a stone and wildflowers planted each spring. The Airbnb they stayed in was taken off the rental site. When asked why, the host simply replied, "It doesn't feel right anymore." Years passed. Brian remained silent. No books, no confessions, no remorse. In a world obsessed with chaos, he had committed his crime with order, a surgical silence that haunted more deeply than screams ever could. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed out of calculation, and that's why he was dangerous, because no one saw it coming, not even her. Brian smiled while dealing cards. He smiled while faking texts. But the next one didn't smile at all. Because some killers don't hide their obsession. They live in it. Derek Lynwood didn't stand out in any room he entered. He didn't speak unless asked. Didn't laugh unless it was polite. He was 41, a high school literature teacher in suburban Ohio who had spent nearly 20 years grading essays, assigning Shakespeare, and quietly eating lunch in the faculty lounge without ever becoming memorable. Students described him as nice but blank. Co-workers said he was stable, quiet, dependable. He lived alone in a modest duplex on the edge of town, never married, no pets. His furniture was plain. His fridge was full of expired condiments and milk. His one real interest, outside of teaching, was poetry. Not the modern kind, but classic American verse. He'd recite lines from Longfellow under his breath while shelving library books. That's how he met Clara Manning. She was 29, a visiting poet from a nearby university who had been hired to run a 3-month creative writing program at Derek's school. She wore bright scarves, quoted Sylvia Plath in conversation, and smiled when she spoke. Derek was smitten by the second staff meeting. She complimented his lesson on Whitman. He brought her coffee every Wednesday. By the third week, she started waiting for him after class. He couldn't believe it at first. Clara was loud where he was quiet, curious where he was guarded. But she said she liked that about him, that he was gentle, kind, solid. For the first time in years, Derek felt something bloom. He shaved every morning, pressed his shirts, walked differently. When the program ended, Clara stayed. She moved into his duplex that spring, bringing with her a vinyl record player, 3 crates of books, and a whirlwind of color. The neighbors were surprised. Derek had never even had guests before, let alone a live-in girlfriend. But they seemed happy, for a while. Then Clara started pulling away. Not in big ways, not yelling or cheating or accusing, just quiet shifts. She spent more time in her studio apartment near campus. She took calls on the balcony. Her writing turned darker. She began talking about residencies, Europe, big cities, things Derek wasn't part of. When he asked if she was unhappy, she said she was figuring things out. He nodded, didn't press. But inside, Derek began unraveling, not with violence, with preparation. He checked her travel calendar, counted how many nights she slept at home, read the sticky notes she left on her desk. He noticed her passport was missing, saw a packed suitcase under the bed. Then one night she left her email open on the shared computer. He didn't mean to look, or so he told himself. But he did. There were messages with a literary agent in New York, references to solo interviews, a sublease agreement. She was leaving. She hadn't told him. He stared at the screen until it went dark. The next morning, he made breakfast, gave her a book of poems wrapped in brown paper. She kissed his cheek, said she had meetings all afternoon. That night, he asked if he could take her picture. "For your new website," he said. "You'll need author photos." She agreed. He set up a white sheet in the living room, borrowed a soft light from the art department, and had her pose in front of the bookshelf. She smiled. He told her to tilt her chin. Then again, a little more. He snapped 10 pictures, then 20. She started laughing, said she felt silly. That's when he walked behind the sheet, picked up the tripod base, heavy, steel, weighted, and brought it down hard on the back of her head. She crumpled instantly. No scream, no sound, just a sharp breath and then silence. Derek didn't move, didn't panic. He just stood there, staring at her body in a slant of light, surrounded by the books she loved. Then he set the camera down and began his plan. He moved in the same slow, practiced way he used when shelving books in the school library. No rush, no mess, no noise. The first thing Derek did after Clara's body went still was close the blinds. Then he unplugged the studio light, wiped the handle, and folded the white sheet. He placed the camera gently on the table. The tripod, dented at the base, was tucked under the sink behind the cleaning supplies. Clara's phone was buzzing on the couch. 3 texts, a missed call. He put it on silent. Then he sat down across from her, not because he was mourning, but because he needed to think. He had already committed to the act. Now came the architecture. She couldn't vanish, not suddenly. That would draw noise. She had to exit slowly, willingly, as if she had always planned it. So he got up, rolled up the rug beneath her body, and used it to drag her down the hall. He didn't carry her. That would leave marks. The hallway was narrow. The back room had no windows. It had been his father's study, now mostly filled with old files, a locked filing cabinet, and spare furniture. Derek opened the wardrobe, cleared it, and placed her body inside, still in the sweater she wore for the photo shoot. He lined the floor of the wardrobe with baking soda and charcoal briquettes, then taped the door shut with duct tape and placed a bookshelf in front of it. He cleaned the floor with bleach wipes, double-checked her phone, then turned off the overhead lights and returned to the living room. It was midnight. He didn't sleep. The next morning, Derek woke at 6 a.m., showered, dressed in his usual collared shirt, and walked to the nearby diner where he always ate Sunday breakfast. He paid with cash, tipped well, and spoke briefly to the server. A receipt time-stamped his alibi. When he returned home, he opened Clara's laptop and began drafting her departure. First, he sent an email to the university department chair. "Hi, just wanted to say thanks again for everything. I've officially accepted a residency in Berlin, long overdue, flying out this week, promise I'll stay in touch." Then another to her writing group. "Quick note, I'm pulling back from local readings for now. Some exciting international work lined up, more soon." He updated her blog with a scheduled post, a scanned poem titled "Windless Exit," and a caption that read, "Sometimes stillness says everything." He even messaged her cousin on Facebook. "Tell Aunt Karen I'll visit Europe first, then the cabin, and that I'm okay." Every detail was surgical. He kept her phone off, turning it on only for outgoing texts, always using her voice, emojis, abbreviations, the way she typed BTW instead of "by the way." He sent just enough to keep people calm, not enough to invite response. Meanwhile, he kept teaching, showed up every morning with coffee, graded papers, led discussions on Emily Dickinson. When people asked about Clara, he said she had landed a grant overseas and was preparing to travel. No one questioned it. She was, after all, the type who might vanish for poetry. A few weeks later, Derek began removing her belongings, a few books at a time, donated to Goodwill in a town 2 counties over. Clothes were boxed and dropped in anonymous bins. Her art supplies were thrown out at night. Bit by bit, she was erased. Her car sat in the garage, covered. He told anyone who asked that she'd left it behind to avoid international rental fees. It was plausible. Everything he said was just plausible enough. The wardrobe in the back room stayed sealed. Every few days he added more baking soda, adjusted the airflow with a small dehumidifier, and checked for scent. Nothing. Clara had been gone for 29 days when her bank froze her account due to inactivity. That triggered a notification to her credit agency, which in turn flagged a discrepancy in her travel plans. An alert was sent to her family. Her sister, who had been suspicious of the sudden silence, filed a missing persons report. Officers came to the duplex. Derek greeted them with tea. He showed them her email farewell, the blog post, the packed suitcase he said she left behind. He even offered up a postcard she had received weeks earlier from Berlin, one he'd mailed to himself using a forwarding service. The officers took notes, asked if Clara had struggled with mental health. Derek said no, but added, "She was a wanderer, a little impulsive, but always brilliant." They left without searching the home. After all, Clara was an adult. No blood, no signs of foul play, just a curious absence. The story might have ended there if not for a student, a senior named Maggie who had been close to Clara through the poetry club. She noticed Clara had stopped replying to all DMs, texts, and emails, even when she wrote something deeply personal. "It's not like her," Maggie told her parents. They called the police. This time, detectives followed up. They requested digital metadata, login IP addresses, account activity. What they found didn't add up. Clara's phone had pinged twice in the same neighborhood where she had supposedly flown out from, both times near Derek's duplex. Her last known logins came from his IP. When questioned again, Derek said she'd temporarily returned after leaving. something he hadn't shared earlier, to protect her privacy. It didn't hold. A search warrant was filed. Officers entered the duplex with cadaver dogs. The dogs hit immediately on the back room, the wardrobe. Derek stood in the hallway, expressionless. When they opened it, they found what remained of Clara, mummified, surrounded by old poetry books and lined with pages of Walt Whitman quotes taped to the walls. One page read, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, then I contradict myself. I am large, I contain multitudes." Derek didn't run, didn't shout. He was arrested on sight, wrists limp in the cuffs. And even then, as the hallway filled with officers, neighbors, and noise for the first time in years, Derek Lynwood didn't say a word. The interrogation began just after sunrise. Derek sat at the end of a long table, hands folded neatly, dressed in the same sweater vest he'd worn to school the day before. He didn't ask why he was there. He didn't ask for a lawyer. He waited until they spoke first. The detective slid a photograph across the table, a grainy shot of the sealed wardrobe, taken just before they'd opened it. Derek looked at it for 7 seconds without blinking. Then he tilted his head slightly and said, "I knew you'd come eventually." That was it. No confession, no details, just an acknowledgement, like he'd been expecting the moment to arrive. The forensic analysis took less than a week. Clara's fingerprints were all over the room, the wardrobe, the walls. The camera still held the SD card with her final images, time-stamped hours before her death. The tripod base showed signs of impact damage, consistent with the trauma identified by the medical examiner. But there were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, just one clean, deliberate strike to the back of the skull. Clara had never seen it coming. Prosecutors moved quickly. The case was airtight. The digital trail he'd left in her name, emails, texts, social posts, was damning. A tech specialist testified about IP logins, scheduled blog entries, VPN masking attempts. Every deception Derek had built unraveled under scrutiny, yet he never objected. He sat through pre-trial hearings in silence. No emotion, no apologies. His defense attorney struggled to mount a case. The only option was diminished capacity. But psychiatric evaluations came back clean. Derek was sane, methodical, emotionally flat, but fully aware. One psychologist described him as obsessively controlled, with a deeply internalized fear of abandonment. In court, he never made eye contact with Clara's family. Her sister, mother, and cousin attended every session, sitting in the front row, sometimes holding hands, sometimes staring at him with a kind of quiet disbelief, not horror, but betrayal. "We trusted you," her mother whispered once outside the courtroom. "We all trusted you." Derek never responded. During the trial, the prosecution painted a portrait of obsession hidden behind routine. They described a man who didn't yell, didn't chase, didn't beg, just watched, planned, and acted. They played the courtroom audio from the SD card, Clara laughing during the photo shoot. The jurors didn't move. Some blinked harder than others. The moment hit like an echo. It was the sound of someone still alive, minutes from vanishing. The verdict came back in under 3 hours. Guilty on all counts. Murder, falsifying digital communications, unlawful disposal of a body, and obstruction. The sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. Derek didn't flinch, didn't speak, just nodded once and walked with the bailiff. The courtroom emptied in silence. Reporters tried to interview Clara's family outside the courthouse. They declined. Her sister released a single written statement. He buried her with poetry. That's how cold it was. The duplex was seized. Investigators later found dozens of notebooks filled with Derek's writing, observations, routine logs, even sketches of where to place the wardrobe. It was all chilling in its normalcy. There were grocery lists beside fake blog drafts, lesson plans beside murder timelines. In one journal, he'd written a single line dozens of times: "Exit, pursued by silence." It was a reference to a Shakespeare stage direction, one he had taught his students the week Clara died. His former school scrubbed his name from the website. His classroom was repainted. The writing club was disbanded. For months, teachers struggled to talk about what had happened. Some tried to explain it as mental illness. Others just stopped speaking altogether. Derek was transferred to a state correctional facility in southern Ohio, where he was housed in a solitary cell due to the high-profile nature of the case. He refused interviews, declined mail, did not speak for the first 6 months. When asked if he had anything to say during intake, he wrote a single sentence on the back of the admissions form: "Some endings are quiet on purpose." Over time, the world moved on. Clara's poems were published posthumously in a collection titled Soft Collapse. The final piece in the book was Windless Exit, the one Derek had posted to her blog. Her family chose to leave it in. "Let people see the last thing she wrote," her sister said, "even if he tried to use it for something else." The book became a bestseller in academic circles. Universities discussed it in seminars about violence, identity, and silence. Meanwhile, Derek remained in the background. He became inmate 002190. He cleaned the same hallway every day, ate at the same table, wrote nothing, spoke to no one. When a journalist sent him a list of questions asking why he did it, Derek responded with a blank envelope containing a single printed photo, one of the shots he'd taken of Clara before he killed her. No note, no name, just her, smiling in soft lighting, framed by a shelf of books. It was the last image anyone ever received from him, and the only one that mattered, because for Derek, words were weapons, but silence was the execution. These killers didn't kill out of rage. They killed with routine, with patience, with planning. They held her hand one day and ended her the next, without ever raising their voice. No screams, no blood on the walls, just quiet exits disguised as love. Mason offered a getaway. Brian poured her wine. Derek took her picture. And when the moment came, none of them trembled. They didn't run. They didn't cry. They simply stepped into the role they'd already rehearsed in their heads 1,000 times. Not monsters, not madmen, just men, methodical, unremarkable, and terrifyingly calm.